70th Ananthakrishnan Colloquium, and this was supposed to schedule to yesterday, but it couldn't happen because of we could not gather a good audience. Today, more people are joining us. So the speaker today is Ishwari Mulkalwar. Is that the right pronunciation? And she is a doctoral student at Department of Oceanography in Scripps. Scripps is a very old and renowned institutes of oceanography in the world. It's in USA. And she's today going to talk about the inertial variability in high frequency radar data and implications and challenges for the new satellite mission ODYSEA. So she was an alumni of, earlier student of ISER Pune, worked with Professor Suhas here. And she then moved for her PhD in Scripps, I guess. And she is almost through the midway or more to complete her PhD. And it's an interesting topic. And so we welcome Ishwari to give a talk. And we'll talk for maybe 40 minutes and then followed by questions and answers. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Am I audible to everyone? So I'm Ishwari. I'm a third-year PhD student at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I'm advised by Dr. Sarah Gilly, who's also the project lead on the satellite mission Odyssey that I'm going to be talking about. As was introduced, I did my BSMS at ISER Pune, so I'm very excited to be back here in the city and get to share my work. So thank you again for the invitation. So today I'm mostly going to be talking about this proposed satellite mission called Odyssey, which measures winds and currents together. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about my PhD work, which is about inertial variability in this radar dataset, and the challenges that poses for the data we'll be getting from the satellite. So the ocean drives the disruptive weather. The Indian Ocean is the source of the water that causes heavy rainfall and cloudbursts, and increasing incidences of cloudbursts have been linked to a warming ocean. And a warmer Indian Ocean also leads to more localized convection, which has a descending arm over northern India, which has caused more severe heat waves in recent years. And in turn, weather events also move the ocean, so tropical cyclones, like the super cyclone Amphan, which developed over the Bay of Bengal in 2020. So these tropical cyclones are also known to have both short-term and long-term influences on the circulation of the ocean. So our understanding of these extreme weather events and these storm systems really depends on how well we understand how the ocean and atmosphere talk to each other. So to that end, the OSIS group, which is this Observing Air-Sea Interaction Strategy group, has proposed 3 grand ideas for the decade 2020 to 2030 that are aimed at improving representation of air-sea interaction. And grand idea number 2 on that list is creating a satellite network that's optimized to measure air-sea fluxes. And that's where Odyssey comes in. So Odyssey stands for Ocean Dynamics and Surface Exchange with the Atmosphere. It's a mission that consists of a Doppler band scatterometer, which is going to simultaneously measure winds and currents at every point. It's got a 5 kilometers horizontal resolution, a 1,700 kilometer wide swath. And it's a joint mission between the Jet Propulsion Lab in the US and the French National Space Agency, CNES. And Sarah Gilly is the PI for the project at Scripps. The project scientist is Tony Lee at JPL. The French lead is Fabrice Ardwan. And Odyssey has been proposed to NASA's Earth Systems Explorer program. 4 missions have been selected for further study, and 2 of these will make the final cut in May 2025. So in this section about Odyssey, I'm going to address 3 main things. So what measurements does Odyssey make? What can we do with the Odyssey measurements? And then I'll give an overview of the mission and talk about how the general community can get more involved and what's going to happen next. So what does Odyssey measure? It measures surface winds to start with. And how do we measure surface winds from space? So what you do via scatterometry is that you measure the backscattered signal from the radar that comes off of these capillary waves on the surface of the ocean. So capillary waves are these like finger-sized centimeter-long waves, which have their crest and troughs perpendicular to the wind direction, and they're a manifestation of wind blowing over any body of water. So what scatterometry does is that you have an incident radar beam, and if you had no wind on the surface of the ocean, if it were completely flat, it would bounce straight off, nothing would come back to the radar. But if you had a rough surface, if you had some wind flowing on the ocean surface, you would have some backscatter that gets measured by the satellite that comes back to the satellite. And the and the other scatterometry is in measuring this backscatter and using a geophysical model function to get the wind speed and direction from it. But the thing is, the backscatter depends on both the wind speed and direction. So a single look does not uniquely tell you both speed and direction. So you need multiple looks to get both the speed and direction. So that's what a scatterometer also does. It takes multiple looks at the same patch of ocean from different angles to get these two values. So QuickScat, which was one of NASA's earlier scatterometers, used two beams for this purpose, an outer beam and an inner beam, and they rotated them to get 4 looks to get one measurement. But one of the innovations of ODYSEA is that it will only require 1 beam and 2 looks to get a measurement. And ODYSEA also uses a Ka band signal, which is much low noise compared to a Ku band or a C band signal that other scatterometers have used in the past. So the low noise gives us better resolution. And ODYSEA is designed for 5-kilometer resolution, which is a big improvement over the 25 kilometers that we generally get from other scatterometer products. ODYSEA is also intending to fill knowledge is also intending to fill the coverage gaps. So this here, so on the left here, we have the advanced scatterometer, which is one of the European Space Agency scatterometers. And as you see, so this is the 1-day coverage of surface vector winds with this satellite. And as you see that it has a narrower spot, so it doesn't really cover the entire globe in a day. But QuickScat, which was one of NASA's earlier scatterometers, has a much wider spot of around 1,800 kilometers. So on the right here, what you see is similar to what we'll get from ODYSEA. So this is the 1-day coverage that you get from ODYSEA. And having such a wide 1-day coverage also gives you better temporal resolution, because that means that almost every point will get sampled at least once a day. And some points can also get sampled twice a day. And the other interesting thing to note is that any scatterometer product measures relative wind. So wind that's relative to the ocean current, which is a useful quantity for calculating fluxes and everything. But if you want to be able to compare the satellite wind to in situ winds, or if you want to be able to use this wind to force models without relative effects, then you need the total wind, which is also another reason you need winds and currents together. And this is a few vector wind measuring satellites that are going to be flying in the 2030-2032 year range, which is when ODYSEA would launch if it gets selected. So here we have ISRO's OceanSat. So these are on sun-synchronous orbits, so they sample twice a day. So OceanSat by ISRO samples at noon and midnight. You have this European scatterometer, which samples at 9:30 a.m., 9:30 p.m., and a few other instruments that sample at 6 a.m., 6 p.m. So you have this big measurement gap between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. and 12 p.m. and 6 p.m., which is missing measurements. So ODYSEA is really designed to slot into this gap. So it will measure at 4 a.m., 4 p.m. every day, and you can close out the scatterometer wide. So you can better sample the diurnal signal, the diurnal cycle, and you can also better observe the evolution of fast processes like storms. And the other really innovative thing about ODYSEA is that you can get both winds and currents using the radar phase. So if the wind were flowing over stationary ocean, the backscattered radar phase would be the same in every direction. But if we had an ocean current and a wind flowing over an ocean current, then the phase of the backscattered radar would get Doppler shifted according to the direction of the current. So a Doppler scatterometer is an instrument which measures this phase and the backscatter to give you both winds and currents in the same measurements. Now, this is not a new technology. Doppler scatterometry has been around for a while. It was recently used in NASA's S-mode mission, where they loaded these Doppler scatterometers onto an aircraft to sample some patches of the Pacific Ocean. But this is really the first time that Doppler scatterometry is being put on a satellite and used to get global measurements. It's also important to note that the current that we get from ODYSEA will be the total current. The surface current has 2 components: a geostrophic component, which is the part that's in geostrophic balance with large-scale pressure gradients and the Coriolis force, and an ageostrophic component, which is the deviation from this geostrophy. The geostrophic component is relatively easier to measure because we can get that from satellite altimeter data, which measures sea surface height. So NASA's SWOT mission recently has provided really high resolution global picture of these geostrophic velocities. But the problem is that the geostrophic balance only holds on scales smaller than the Rossby radius, so smaller than around 100 kilometers, which means that this altimeter data is really missing out the small scale velocities, and also you don't have the geostrophic component. So this geostrophic velocity is a blurred lens through which we see the large scale currents. And the geostrophic component is an important component because it includes all the small scale short term processes, but it's really hard to measure. It's usually just measured by in situ instruments like drifters, or you have some remote sensing instruments, but they only measure like over small patches of the ocean. Sometimes this geostrophic component is approximated by the Ekman velocity, which comes from the Ekman balance. But there's also problems with this because the Ekman balance only represents the wind-driven component of the geostrophic current, and there can be other factors which lead to geostrophy. And also the Ekman velocity itself is an approximation of the wind-driven component because it comes from an idealized balance. But ODYSEA will be measuring the true total surface current without any such approximations. And I've mentioned this before, but like just to take a quick look at the improvement in resolution. So on the left here, we have resolution for the wind. And there's a few of those scatterometers I mentioned earlier, QuickScat, ASCAT. And all of these do have pretty much global coverage in 2 days. But ODYSEA does show really significant improvement in horizontal resolution here. And on the right here, we have current resolution. So currently, we don't really have any instruments that measure currents on a global scale. So that's the one big contribution that ODYSEA will make. But the ODYSEA horizontal resolution for currents will be around 25 kilometers and not 5 kilometers because there's some averaging that happens to reduce some noise. But yeah, that's about the measurements of ODYSEA. And now what can we do with winds and currents together? So there's a lot of things we can do. We can measure LC fluxes, momentum fluxes, heat fluxes, freshwater fluxes, gas fluxes. But the two main science questions that the ODYSEA team has listed in its proposal is number one, that's understanding wind current coupling. So since we now have these first ever measurements of winds and currents together, we can really see what's the current response on winds. Wind stress curl at the surface induces vertical motion in the atmospheric boundary line. And we want to see if this wind stress curl is affected by the underlying current. So there's a few different hypotheses for this. One hypothesis says that the ocean current doesn't really influence the wind stress curl. Another set of studies says that the ocean current influences the wind stress locally, but not winds farther away. And another set of studies says that the ocean current influences both remote and local winds. So this is something that we can definitely unentangle with ODYSEA's measurements. And the other interesting question, now that we have global measurements of surface currents, is how these currents will respond to different environmental situations. So for example, global warming. So how will surface currents respond to warming climate? One hypothesis for this is that a warming climate means higher stratification, which means a thinner mixed layer, which means that the momentum is confined in a thinner layer, which causes the currents to accelerate. And this is something that has been shown by a few global circulation models that in a warming situation, surface currents do accelerate. But that's what happens on the large scale. Seasonal submesoscale dynamics show us a different picture. So here we have the submesoscale vorticity from the Kuroshio extension. And on the left here, we have the vorticity at the end of winter. And we see that the submesoscales are a lot more energized than at the end of summer. And this is attributed to the fact that in winter, you have a deeper mixed layer, which stores more available potential energy, which can lead to more eddy kinetic energy. So that's the second hypothesis, which says that in a warming climate, you would have lower stratification, you would have higher stratification, so thinner mixed layer, so low potential energy being stored, less eddy kinetic energy, and slower currents. Again, it's very likely that both of these hypotheses act together, but just on different scales. This again really underscores the need for more extensive global observations of winds and currents on a range of scales. Right, so I'll give a brief mission overview. ODYSEA is really designed to fill into a void of science and operational capabilities because currently we don't have any satellites that measure global currents. We don't have any US scatterometers that measure winds, and the ones that do not have a 5-kilometer resolution. And we don't have any measurements in the midnight to 6 a.m. range. ODYSEA offers 90% global coverage in less than a day. It's a 4 a.m., 4 p.m. orbit. ODYSEA will have wind and current products in near real time. So they'll be available like after 6 hours after the observations are collected. It's one of the 4 Earth Systems Explorers missions selected for 9 months of further study. So the science has been approved. But now there's questions about implementation and budget that need to be addressed. And of these 2 missions will be selected for launch in 2030 and 2032. And you can also get involved in this. You can test out science ideas using the ODYSEA simulator, which is available on the GitHub. You can let the ODYSEA team know if you want to be an early adopter and contribute to operational or science enhancements. The ODYSEA team is really looking forward to hearing from applications users about their needs at this stage. And you can join the discussion. There's a seminar series that happens every Tuesday. It's available, the recordings are available on YouTube. It's going to be 8 a.m. Pacific time, 9:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So this actually concludes the ODYSEA section of my talk. If there's questions about this, I can take them now, or I can move on to the next section too.
Is it already on board? It's already flying?
No, I think so. The thing is, they submitted the proposal, so now that they have 9 months to prove that this can be actually a feasible satellite.
Only planning stage.
Yeah, it's a proposed mission. Yeah.
What are the advantage you are expecting comparing to the previous other missions, similar scatterometer missions?
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage is having current measurements, because we don't have that on a global scale, total current measurements, because altimeter products like SWOT from NASA, which measured the ocean topography, so sea surface height, that gave us geostrophic velocities, but we don't have total current. And also this is really high resolution wind data too. So that will help with resolving things like coastlines and getting a better idea of where we have rain, because that's something current wind scatterometer products don't resolve. They're bad at looking at rain and stuff. Yeah.
But Oscar currents are also there, no? That is also
OSCAT, yeah.
from altimetry and Ekman is added to it.
Yeah.
How different is Oscar product and this product?
So I'm not actually aware of the current data that you're talking about.
It's from satellite altimetry.
Yeah.
One component is geostrophy.
Yeah.
Geostrophy mostly Ekman.
Yeah.
Coming from scatterometer winds.
Yeah.
It's a merged product.
Right. So that is something I think, I will need to look into that. But the problem with that is you're not really looking at the smaller scale processes, because Ekman doesn't really cover all the geostrophic motions that you have, because you can have like frontal instabilities, you can have like loss of balance on smaller scales, which doesn't come into just the Ekman component. And that the Ekman velocity also comes from an idealized slab layer model, which is not often valid in a lot of regions. So this actually measures the true current.
So it is the first time I have a radar being on board to measure the currents, HF radar.
So this is not HF radar. So this is just the scatterometer thing. I'm going to talk about radar after this. Yeah.
This is the first such mission. I mean, because ultimately is making the height, but not the.
Yeah. So the Doppler thing, which is what measures the currents, is new, and they have used a Doppler scatterometer on small airborne missions, so not on a satellite.
Not on a satellite.
Yeah. The difference is it's a satellite and it's a long-term mission and it's on a global scale.
So I just want to know what accuracy it will give with respect to scatterometer and Doppler scatterometer. You have a good resolution you are talking.
Yeah.
What about the accuracy of the winds as well as its direction?
So I feel like the wind accuracy should be pretty much the same as traditional scatterometry, because that's not something they're doing anything different there. But for the Doppler, like the current part of it, that's a very good question, because the currents that this Doppler scatterometer measures, there's lots of questions about that. Like, is it the current that's affected by these capillary waves? Is it the current that's affected by the Stokes drift? So I think there's still work being done on the geophysical model function that will convert this backscatter to our actual wind and current velocities. But the accuracy for the wind should be the same as any scatterometer product. It's just that the currents, there's things in flux.
When you say the currents, so is it the currents of surface ocean or is it the current of upper 30 meters?
I think it's the upper maybe 10 meters, not 30. Yeah.
Because what Oscar says is about 35 meters. Oscar is having a combination of altimeter
Okay.
and spectrometer.
Right.
So they get geostrophy from altimeter, as he said, and a geostrophy from spectrometer. And they say that it's a upper 30 meter they get.
Yeah.
Widely used product by community.
Okay. Yeah.
Will it be possible to measure the cold pools generated by the oceanic MCS? Because that is another important area of research, because the cold pools are because it measures the ocean winds. These cold pools, which actually are part of the MCS, and they are actually the feedback mechanism for expanding the MCS life cycle.
Are there problems with measuring that? With
Right now, they are measuring with the spectrometers, but
Okay.
with the Doppler capability, that will be having impact.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, the Doppler part, I think it's not a new technology, but there's still things that need to be tested. Yeah, but yeah, maybe it could. I mean, it will have better resolution for the winds to start with, so that should definitely help.
What's the higher winds, like cyclone conditions?
Mhm.
And you said very high resolutions are there. So is there any aeroplane, you said you have done the experiment. Is there any high wind measurements are there where cyclone features are coming? Like you said, 2 kilometer, 5 kilometer resolution. So it will be very, very fascinating to see the high resolution winds under the cyclone.
For sure. So S-mode, which is the submesoscale ocean dynamics experiment, was a small, like 3-month-long mission, I think, that NASA recently did. Maybe not, I'm not sure of the exact timeline, but that's exactly what they did. They used an aircraft to measure currents and winds together at really high resolution. And I'm not sure if they captured all like the high wind variability, but yeah, that's definitely, I think there's a few results out from that experiment too.
Probably we can move on
Yeah.
to the next. Then finally we'll take the discussion.
We'll take more questions. Okay. That was about. Okay. Yeah, so now I'll talk a little bit about the work I've been doing in my PhD. So we just saw that ageostrophic wind-driven motions will benefit from the observations that we get from ODYSEA. And one such ageostrophic wind-driven motion is near-inertial internal waves in the ocean. So what are these waves? So we know that the Earth is a rotating body. It's a non-inertial frame of reference, which means that it has a pseudo-force, the Coriolis force, which causes deviations in the motions of bodies. And a famous example of this is Foucault's pendulum. So if you've not seen that before, it's just like a regular pendulum. It's just super long and heavy. So it has a really slow time period. And it should just swing in a single plane, but it doesn't do that because the time period is slow enough to be affected by the rotation of the Earth. So the orbit of it precesses. And ocean waters are also subject to the same force that's deviating this pendulum, which acts as a restoring force for perturbations resulting in inertial oscillations. Now, these inertial oscillations, they have a frequency that's given by this Coriolis parameter. It's 2 omega sine phi. Omega is the rotation rate of the Earth. Phi is the latitudinal angle. So this inertial frequency varies from 1 to 2 cycles per day in the mid-latitude, so it's pretty high frequency. The inertial period is around like 70 hours in the tropics. In the higher latitudes, it's around 10 hours. And these inertial oscillations, they cause like these large-scale convergences and divergences in the mixed layer, and they pump the base of the mixed layer to create these near-inertial internal waves, which are basically internal gravity waves with a frequency that's close to the inertial frequency. And yeah, despite being like an ageostrophic, short-term, wind-driven phenomenon, these near-inertial waves are actually a really highly energetic component of the total current. So this here is a picture from a famous experiment done by Eric DeSaro et al. In 1995. It was called the Ocean Storms experiment. And these here show the drifter tracks after the passage of a storm in the Northern Hemisphere. So you can see these characteristic inertial oscillations, and they're clockwise because we're in the Northern Hemisphere here, and in the Southern Hemisphere, they would be anti-clockwise. So the velocity of these inertial observations was observed to be as large as the geostrophic velocities. So these near-inertial waves can carry majority of the surface kinetic energy after large wind forcing. And what they do with that energy is that some of it gets radiated away in the low modes, so modes with less vertical motion. Some of it goes into increasing boundary layer turbulence and deepening the mixed layer. And some of it goes down into the abyss in the form of these waves, where they overturn and they break and mix. And they contribute to the mixing required to maintain the abyssal circulation in the ocean. So near-inertial waves really play a key role in the pathway through which wind stirs up the ocean. But they're very intermittent and hard to observe because you only really see them after storms and they last for a short time. And the other problem with observing these waves is that they're nearly invisible to satellite altimetry, and this is because they are the geostrophic component. The geostrophic component can be measured from sea surface height because the stream function is then proportional to the eta, sea surface height deviations. But near-inertial waves are ageostrophic, so they cannot be measured from sea surface height. But I say nearly invisible and not completely invisible here because these are really large-scale motions, so they interact pretty strongly with the mesoscale. So they actually modulate the geostrophic velocities that we get from spot. So near-inertial waves are pretty important to study, and they will be important to the total currents that we measure with ODYSEA. And this ODYSEA data really presents us interesting opportunities to study these questions about near-inertial waves. So one of the big questions is improving estimates of wind work. So wind work is the work that the wind does in mixing up the ocean. And here, this figure here is from a paper by Matthew Alford, which chronicles like 54 years worth of wind work estimates. So you see that the graph for wind work has generally been trending up. And the reason behind this is now that we have more high resolution observations, so we're better able to resolve these short-term processes like storms, which contribute to a lot of the wind work. So really, the measurements from ODYSEA, along with an improved understanding of near-inertial waves, can really help to close down this wind work budget. The other interesting question that people have been really looking into recently is the scale of these motions and how they interact with the mesoscale. Because near-inertial waves, when they're first generated, they're generated on storm forcing scales, which are much larger than the ocean scales. Atmosphere scales are larger than the ocean scales. So they're set at around 100 kilometers at first. And in order for them to propagate vertically, these scales need to become attenuated. And this happens usually by interacting with mesoscale features like vortices and fronts. So this picture here is from a study by Lin and Young, who looked at the interaction of near-inertial waves with vortices. And so this is depth versus plot. So this is like a 2D slice of their simulation. So at the start, we see that the near-inertial energy is pretty much like spread out over a broad region. And then once the simulation it gets concentrated in these regions of anticyclonic vorticity, which is where we see the maximum downward propagation. So this whole thing is known as the inertial drainpipe effect, where these anticyclonic vortices sort of drain out the inertial energy from the surface layer. So we would be better able to understand features like this with the improved resolution we get from ODYSEA. So while we would get a clearer horizontal structure of these waves, the near-inertial waves will still get aliased with the 1700 kilometer wide swath, because 1700 kilometer wide means daily sampling, which means a Nyquist frequency of half cycle per day, and near-inertial waves are 1 to 2 cycles per day, so there will be significant aliasing. So the challenge really is to tease apart these motions and be able to isolate the aliased near-inertial signal from these ODYSEA measurements. So one of the ways to do this, what I'm doing in my PhD right now, is looking at a regional high-frequency data set that measures surface currents, and then get an empirical estimate of the near-inertial variability, and then use that to constrain these ODYSEA observations. So the data set I'm looking at is the high-frequency radar data. So this comes from a network of land-based radars along the US coastline. The region I'm looking at is the California current region. So it's the US West Coast. California current is an eastern boundary current, so there's some upwelling there. It has a strong seasonal signature to it. And the inertial frequency in this latitude range is 1 to 1.5 cycles per day. So these radars, they measure currents from the upper 2.4 meters, so it's pretty much just the surface. This is hourly data. It's also pretty high resolution, 6 kilometer resolution. And it's the long time record from the start of 2012 to current day. So this is a really great data set, really high resolution to look at neo-inertial motions. And if we look at some of the decorrelation scales in this data set, the decorrelation length scale is around 50 to 100 kilometers. We got that from the E-folding scale of the spatial autocorrelation. The decorrelation time scale is around 3 hours. And what this means is that the characteristic length scales that are present in this data set are several times the spacing between grid points. So we should be able to resolve these motions with the resolution we have here, and also larger than the ODYSEA satellite resolution. So ODYSEA should also be able to resolve these. And the time scale, 3 hours, is long enough to resolve neo-inertial motions. So now we can look at some spectra from this data set. So on the left here, we have the clockwise component of the rotary spectrum. And so the 5 different curves are 5 different latitudes. They're increasing northward. And you can see the characteristic like tidal peaks at 1 cycle per day, 2 cycle per day, then other tidal harmonics. But in between 1 and 2 cycles per day, we see this neo-inertial peak that's wider and that's increasing in frequency as we go up in the latitude. And that's the neo-inertial band. And if we plot the same thing in like a latitude frequency plot, we've got these two like big tidal peaks, and then we've got this energy in the middle, which is the neo-inertial energy. And if we fit the theoretical trend that we expect the peak frequency to follow with latitude, which is f given by 2 omega sine phi, we see that it fits pretty much exactly on top of this, this band. So this means that, and also not a lot of the energy is present in the counterclockwise part, since this is data from the northern hemisphere, so a lot of that motion is just clockwise. So this means that the HFR spectra show a clear polarized neo-inertial signal. But is this signal related to the local winds? So we look at some coherence values with the local ERA5 winds. This is the surface 10-meter wind product. And we see that the clockwise winds do provoke a clockwise response in the inertial currents at the inertial frequencies, but in the counterclockwise part, it's kind of missing. So the HFR currents are indeed coherent with the local winds at the inertial frequency. And this happens despite the fact that ERA5 winds themselves don't have any neo-inertial variability in that frequency range. But that's largely because a lot of the high frequency variability gets smoothed out in the reanalysis dataset to get a red spectrum out of it. But even though the winds don't have any neo-inertial variability, they can still incite a neo-inertial response, because inertial oscillations are also generated as an impulse response. They don't really need a resonance for them to happen. So now we want to look at the evolution of this neo-inertial energy. So we bandpass filtered around this inertial band. So it's f plus minus 0.05 cycles per day. And then we look at like climatology of the seasonal cycle of the neo-inertial energy. So on the right here, the blue line shows the neo-inertial kinetic energy from the HFR surface currents. And the x-axis is months of the year. So we see that the energy is stronger in the winter, which correlates with the ERA5 surface current winds. Surface winds. So this goes to show that, I mean, this is sort of expected because in the winter you have more winter storms, so you have more wind forcing, so more inertial currents. But the interesting thing is that the total currents show a different picture. So the inertial component peaks in the winter, but the total currents are actually stronger in the summer. So this goes back to one of the science objectives that I mentioned with ODYSEA, that we don't know what's happening at different scales, how different scales respond to different stratifications in different seasons. So that also underscores this question of what scales do these motions occupy. We also noticed that the neo-inertial energy in this HF data set is amplified offshore. So the seasonality is also stronger offshore, the energy is stronger offshore. And this is something that has been seen in literature before. So this paper here was looking at the neo-inertial variability in the New England shelf region. And they also saw that in the nearshore regions, you had less neo-inertial energy. And they attributed this to the fact that there could be a baroclinic wave emanating from the coastal wall, which can damp neo-inertial motions. So this is a complicated motion, we really need a dynamical model to be able to model these waves, taking into account things like bathymetry and coastal shelves. Yeah, and so now that we've looked at a few statistics of this neo-inertial energy, now we can focus on a single neo-inertial event and see what that looks like. So here we just have the inertial energy that's filtered from the entire surface current data. And we see that there's a strong peak around late November 2019. So this peak corresponded to a winter storm that also happened in November 2019. So now let's look at what happened around that storm. So I'm going to show a short video here. So on the left here, I just have the inertial kinetic energy. So this was filtered out from the total currents. In the middle here, I have the ERE5 winds, speed and direction. So the contours show the speed, arrows show the direction. And the right panel here is the inertial wind work, which is the wind stress dot product with the inertial current velocity. And this animation is going to start like a few days before the storm and then go on for a few days after the storm. So we see what happens. Storm hits now, and you see a peak in the neo-inertial energy. And it dies out in a bit. So I'll do that again to note a few things. Okay. Yeah. So the storm hits, and we see that these neo-inertial motions actually have a pretty large scale. So they occupy around like 100 to 200 kilometers, and they also persist for quite a few days. The storm forcing is short-lived for a few hours, but the motions persist for at least 3 days after the storm event. So both of these observations are pretty crucial to the measurements we get from ODYSEA, because this tells us that despite being such high frequency motions, they do have a strong signature in the surface current that lasts in the system for a while. So what's next for this project? So do these observations that we've seen from this empirical data set, do they actually match with the data we'll be getting from ODYSEA? So we have a simulator for that. So I could compare it with the simulator data and see what kind of neo-inertial model is needed to match these observations. Can we show the influence of the mesoscale structure on the spatial spread of this neo-inertial energy? And can we isolate this neo-inertial signal and the wind work going into this neo-inertial band from the ODYSEA data? So that's kind of it. I'll just briefly go over this. So we're getting really high resolution measurements of winds and currents from ODYSEA. And this will really give us a unique opportunity to study these wind-driven ageostrophic processes like neo-inertial waves. These neo-inertial currents will be aliased into the total current from ODYSEA, and this is a challenge, which requires a dynamical retrieval of the neo-inertial signal. The HF radar dataset contains strong neo-inertial variability, which is coherent with the local wind. And the neo-inertial events that we've seen in this data set show spatial scales of 100 to 150 kilometers, and they persist for a few days. And this means that the signal will show up in ODYSEA, and it's important to remove it. And we've seen that the neo-inertial energy peaks in the winter months, which is different from the total kinetic energy. And the seasonality is stronger in the offshore regions. And these are interesting observations which really underscore the need for a dynamical model for the neo-inertial waves. That's it for my talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice talk, and we can take questions now. Anand. Yeah.
So when you talk about the inertial kinetic energy of inertial part and kinetic energy of the total current, so how they are related, and that's what I want to know.
Right. So the inertial part I got from like filtering the currents. So I bandpass filtered it around the inertial frequency to just get that energy out of it. And then I compared that energy to the total energy. So just that part of the spectrum compared to the total.
So how much percentage wise, if we saw?
So it depends. Near a wind forcing event, it can be like 50 to 80% of the total. But usually it's like around 5% for the total 12-year record. The average was 5%.
Have you seen high resolution models, how they are doing for this, your inertial kinetic energy things?
So like, how is this energy like represented in
In the high resolution models, like we have a very 1 kilometer also ocean regional simulations are available.
Right.
So how models are representing this energy spectrum which you are looking from the observations?
The energy spectrum from model data also looks pretty similar to what we saw here. One of the important things is a lot of models don't have the temporal resolution that you need for these waves. Spatial resolution is one thing, but temporal resolution is what you really need for this high frequency waves, because even a lot of models don't resolve the semi-diurnal tide well. So that's when it gets into the high frequency range. Like a lot of like the ERA5 product, for example, it just smooths out all the inertial variability. They fit to the tides, but they smooth out the inertial variability to get a red spectrum out of it. But yeah, in the sort of high frequency resolution data sets that we do see, either from model or in situ data, the spectrum looks pretty similar.
Then what new you are going to get from your Odyssey as far as this inertial kinetic energy is concerned?
The idea is, well, there's a few things we can look at. So, I mean, yeah, I can use any other data set too. I don't necessarily need to use this data set, but this is something that's maintained at Scripps, and there's like a huge like people to talk to, a whole infrastructure, so it's easier for me to use this data. And the other thing is, so it's not just the spectrum that's interesting to us, because spectrum just gives you like an average picture, right? Like over a long time. We want to look at these singular events, because even the spectrum doesn't answer questions about what's the scale of these events. So that's something we really need the temporal, we need to be in the time space to look at that. So that's something I want to use this data set for, so I can like track individual storm events and see what's happening with the inertial energy in that region. And then can we like model the inertial response as like a response to the wind forcing? Like, should we use a slab model for this? Should we use a different kind of model for this? Like, what's most appropriate? So those are still unanswered questions. Yeah.
Have you tested it for any storm cases already, or?
So this was the one case I've looked at recently. And I did a brief, like I tried to fit an impulse response to the storm forcing for this. And that was very interesting because I did not add any near inertial frequency to that function, but it still looked like a wave with, like a sinusoid with the inertial frequency. So yeah, so that's one thing I've done to see how the ocean should respond to the storm, and do we actually see it in the data? So comparing these two things.
Yeah, next question. Is there any question from audience? So I have a one. You said that inertial kinetic energy and total kinetic energy, they are totally different. But when I see the plot, they are all like a U curve. But what difference are you talking there?
Oh.
They look identical to me.
Sorry, I think I did not.
This and the past, they look identical. Why you said it's different? I mean, yeah, they are. This is Jan to December, right? And going a dip in July. Go to the previous one.
So this is the previous one.
Oh, you comparing these two? All right.
So here the red line is the wind.
I thought that and the previous. Okay, yeah, they are totally different. You are right. So there is one recent study by observations of high frequency currents in the coastal waters that in the subinertial scale, the currents are drifting to the left of the wind. This is published in Science in our sister organization INCOIS. They led the work. It's McFadden is the lead author, but Girish, who observed it, is the second author. It's a recent. I mean, this is theoretically predicted, but never proven because such observations were. But in the current meter measurement shows the subinertial. But anything above inertial is to the right. But in the subinertial, the solutions may lead to that the currents are drifting to the west. But this is not very impactful. But it's very recently published in Science from INCOIS. You should refer to that. So they were reconciling the theory that some were predicted 50, 60 years ago, saying such currents are possible. Yeah.
So what the theory says about that is, so why do motions drift to the right? Because we have this large scale rotation.
Right.
But if the local rotation rate is actually opposite to the large scale rotation. So if you're in a really strong anticyclonic vortex, so that's opposite to your inertial frequency, then in that local region, the inertial frequency is a different thing. So
Okay.
now you can rotate left, right, anything
Right,
can happen.
exactly.
So it's the local vorticity that matters for these things too.
Yeah, I think now
Um,
the solution is not the local vorticity. In the sub-inertial scale, the solutions are some form of functions which does not respect the inertial rotation.
Right.
Yeah, it is non-inertial rotations
Okay.
basically. So the regime exists only in the sub-inertial scale. So I just quickly read the paper, but I
Okay.
think that's what they are talking about. Yeah,
So-
you should look at,
Yeah.
because why I posed this question, HF radar data from the ocean, probably resolving on seconds, right? Those currents, how frequent is your observations?
So this is hourly, but that's like
Hourly, yeah. But you
interpolated
can
form.
have a even higher resolution from radar,
The
right?
raw data is
Radar
actually
data, you guys are having a seconds, right? Oh, right. So
winds.
NIOT have.
Yeah.
what? HF radar, correct.
IoT has a coastal.
NIOT have a coastal HF radar.
Mm.
We have a coastal currents.
Yeah, but how frequency are they? Because how quickly they make measurement? Atmospheric is every second, or how is that measurement?
Maybe, but are there
Weather radars
that scale?
It's volumetric scans. It's
Right,
It will be very different.
different, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that observations will be now coming to how models look into it. See, in models they resolve all, as you said, may not be available for you to analyze it because they don't sample at that high frequency. But saying so, if you don't impose tidal cycle, model won't resolve. But again, you said inertial cycles are inherent within. Resonant forcings are not required. So models will have those. That
Right.
is the one thing. Another interesting question is what the role of stratification in this inertial waves, or is it anything important because ocean is highly stratified, and then
Right.
do you see any importance of stratification versus this inertial frequency? Do they interact?
Yeah. I mean, there is some work that's mostly done by Matthew Alford's group, which shows that the mixed layer depth is affected by these inertial currents because there's just like increased turbulence, more mixing. Yeah, other than that, I'm not.
Maybe the propagation direction may affected by the local n square in
Yeah.
the water.
That-
So
yeah,
that
yeah,
may be something new as well.
That could be true.
The
Yeah.
internal waves mostly are so much inclined and they propagate up inclined directions because of stratification.
Inclined.
Inclined, yeah.
Yeah. And these are near, so there's almost horizontal.
Horizontal,
Yeah.
yeah. Because they are so quick.
Yeah.
So n square time scale is 6 hours or more, but these are even smaller than that, perhaps.
These are
Sub-inertial
because
larger,
yeah.
then the n square should have some impact. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to look at. All these add extra frequency to the system. So
Yeah.
inertia,
Yeah.
sub-inertia, n square, etc. Yeah. Any other provoking questions from audience, students? So ODYSEA is a planned mission again, but then you said some synthetic simulation. So do they have simulations of the?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you were telling in the beginning. These are coming from those, right? Yeah,
these are-
exactly. That.
Yeah. But the one I was mentioning is the simulator, which is available. So you can run the simulator and get some data from that.
All right.
So it just like simulates the kind of winds and currents you would
And
observe.
how quickly the orbit visit back a particular location in ODYSEA? Will it resolve inertial waves? Because
It won't. No.
then how are you connecting
You are
ODYSEA with
getting a
inertial waves?
snapshot every
Every day.
half day, right?
Yeah, every day. At some places it's twice a day, but mostly it's every day. So yeah, that's the biggest problem that you won't be able to resolve
Ah,
near inertial oscillations with ODYSEA data. So that's the whole question. Like, what sort of model do you fit to these ODYSEA observations to be able to get this?
okay.
Yeah.
But multiple quick scat data will help you to get that. Because you are feeling the gap of the 12 hours. So you may have every 3 or
Possibly.
4 hours.
Absolutely. But even that's very like really close because even with 3.
There is a multiple KIPSCAT back to back running.
Every 3 hours, there's scatterometer.
Oh.
Different agencies have a scatterometer winds are there. And her currents are going hand to hand with the winds. So if you have a high resolution winds, you may get these waves in that.
Don't have high resolution currents with the other.
It's operating at a different resolution.
Currents are there from HF radars.
But HF radar is a very small network.
It's only the coastal.
Yeah.
Coastal.
Land based, so it's only like on the coast.
Yeah, maybe.
It's like mostly northern hemisphere, like part of the globe.
Interesting. Yes, any other questions? Otherwise, we'll thank the speaker. And she returned today. They really want to give the talk. Sorry for that. Yesterday we could not organize it, but it was a nice talk. And
Yes, yeah, good.
we
New information.
Yeah.
What's your plan? You will be continuing with this ODYSEA project, or so your PhD is what is stage you are about to finish, or?
I have not even qualified, so this is kind of just like starting with this project. I think I will continue with the ODYSEA project for a while because I'm funded through it. So at least like one project finish this work and then maybe do something else.
Best.
all the best. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you, audience, for joining.